Hi there. This week we'll be looking at the relationship between existential philosophy and ethics. We begin with the Bible. In order to understand Kierkegaard's ethics of faith, one needs to read the story of Abraham and Isaac from the first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. Testing Abraham's faith, God asks Abraham to sacrifice his own son as a sign of his devotion. Abraham willingly obliges God's request, but at the last minute is stopped by an angel that reveals it was all just a test. Now, the story of Abraham presents us with a man who's torn by what seems to be a contradiction. On the one hand, Abraham knows that it's wrong to kill, and the gravity of this commandment is even heavier considering that it's his own son that he's being asked to kill. On the other hand, he knows that it's also wrong not to have faith and follow the word of God absolutely. Accordingly, despite the apparent contradiction, he makes the most logical choice that he can. Given that it's God that makes all the commandments, God's word is final. So if God asks me to kill my son, I should kill my son, despite what he's commanded me to do in the past. Kierkegaard posits that this decision would have filled Abraham with existential dread, for regardless of how he chooses, the apparent outcome is horrific. Either he loses the son, or he invokes the wrath of God. The decision is also an absurd one. Why would God contradict himself? Why would he ask me to do something wrong? Nonetheless, Abraham falls back upon his own faith, and this is exactly the ethical lesson that Kierkegaard is trying to impart to his audience, for he sees Abraham's dilemma as the quintessential moral dilemma of any true believer. Kierkegaard observes that the Christian faith that he follows is full of contradictions. For example, how could God be both God and man in the character of Jesus? How can God be tripartite in nature, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit between them? How can God give the universe order and then contradict the universe's own laws in miracles? How can an all-knowing, all-loving God allow evil and tragedy to exist in the world? And so on. These don't seem to make sense, yet what religious devotion calls for isn't for one to make sense of all of God's reasons for doing things. Rather, one must be completely faithful to God, no matter how painful that faith may be for them. Kierkegaard calls those with such a profound degree of resignation to God's will the knights of faith. On the one hand, these knights are knights of resignation, for they resign themselves to God's will no matter what. Likewise, they are knights of the infinite, for their faith in God has no limits. Yet faith is itself a concrete thing, an act that must be chosen and acted out in concrete motions. In true keeping with the often paradoxic nature of faith, the knight of faith, quote, makes the movements of infinity, but he does this with such correctness and assurance that he constantly gets the finite out of it, and there's not a second when one has a notion of anything else, end quote. To the best of the knight's ability, he yields himself to the universal commandments of God, though in practice this means seeing those universal abstract ethical laws in the knight's very particular and concrete day-to-day experiences. Paradoxically, these individual moments are more important than the universal laws themselves, for it is in practice that one's faith becomes a reality. Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical. Telos is the Greek word for ends. A teleological ethic is therefore one concerned with choosing a good end or outcome as the guide for one's decisions. Teleological ethics are usually contrasted with deontological ethics, which get their name from the Greek word deon, which means duty. A deontologist believes that we have a duty to act certain ways regardless of the outcome. For instance, the Ten Commandments are an example of a strict deontological ethic. They represent 10 duties that you must always follow and never break. The Fifth Commandment, for instance, says, "Thou shalt not kill." Thus, under no circumstances is it permissible to kill another human being. A teleological ethicist would likely have a problem with this. What if someone was threatening to kill your family or yourself or other innocent victims? If killing them was the only way of stopping them, wouldn't the lives saved justify that murder? A strict deontologist following the no-kill rule would have to say no. Kierkegaard posits one's faith and belief in God as the highest ends that one can strive for. He therefore falls into the teleological camp of ethics. The paradox stems from the end that he's chosen. If faith and belief in God is the highest end, why did God give us specific duties to follow? This is to say that in the religious literature of the faithful, God has prescribed a number of specific ethical duties for humanity, like those of the Ten Commandments, or, in the New Testament, Jesus' version of the Golden Rule, which is, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. What comes first, the telos of believing in God and cultivating one's faith towards Him, or the particular duties that He has prescribed? Here's the paradox. One can follow the commandments of the Bible without having faith in God. Likewise, one can have a very strong faith in God without respecting the ethical duties of the Bible. Paradoxically, one has a duty to believe and have faith in God, but one also has duty towards others, and sometimes these seem to conflict. Kierkegaard drives right into this paradox and observes that although Christianity's ethical duties are presented as universal, they can only be achieved in the particular. Therefore, every ethical decision involves a leap from outside of the universal into a moment of particular and subjective choice and action, the ends of which, he says, can only be chosen through a moment of blind faith. Faith is therefore both the means and the ends of ethical action. Here's how this works. In his essay, Existentialism and Humanism, Jean-Paul Sartre offers a now famous illustration of this point that I'll paraphrase. Imagine that the United States has been taken over by a particularly nefarious regime. Under occupation, millions are suffering. Now a friend comes to you and offers you a chance to join the underground resistance against these invaders. Meanwhile, at home, your parents have taken ill and need your daily help just to survive. What do? Sartre gives this example as a means of showing that in such a particular case, ethical universals are essentially useless. We generally accept that one should do their utmost to fight for universal human rights against those that would destroy them. Likewise, we also generally accept that one has a duty to respect and care for their family and loved ones. Yet in this case, one must choose between one or the other, and no matter how one chooses, the outcome will be bad. If I choose to help my parents, the invaders may win, and millions more lives may be lost. If I choose to fight back, my parents may die. It's a lose-lose situation. Kierkegaard sees every ethical decision of being of this nature, though the losses aren't always so pronounced. As we saw a couple weeks ago, Heidegger acknowledges that every human decision involves some degree of guilt, the reason being that every time I help one person or another group of people, I'm simultaneously choosing not to help another person or another group of people. Every time I choose to do one good act, there are other possible ones that I leave undone. Ultimately, then, all one can do is make the best of each choice they make. Between ethical universals, one ultimately has to make up their own mind, follow their own heart, and follow their own faith in what they think is the best choice, suspending all universal ethics as they go about their personal and particular decision. Kierkegaard says, quote, "The paradox of faith is this, that the individual is higher than the universal," end quote. The opposite of this knight of faith would be what Kierkegaard calls the tragic hero, one who, quote, "renounces himself in order to express the universal," end quote. As a vague example of this, he speaks of vagabonds and roving geniuses, presumably those so obsessed with their pursuit of universal truth that they can do nothing else, and reduce themselves to wandering in poverty in the search for their own enlightenment. In contrast, the knight of faith, quote, "renounces the universal in order to become the individual," end quote. The knight has only their own faith and passion to guide them, and show them how to serve both God and man sufficiently. Kierkegaard then goes on to describe some of the more general characteristics of what this knight of faith would look like, and how this knight of faith would go about his daily life, or her daily life. Much like Kierkegaard, Jaspers begins by saying that any kind of objective ethics will inevitably result in contradictions with itself. The point is Nietzschean. Objective values constantly run into conflict with each other, compete, and even destroy each other. For example, one may value all living things, but some of them necessarily have to die if one wants to eat and survive. Or one may value their free time outside of work, but value it too much and you'll end up in poverty. Likewise, everything we value brings us into conflict with other things that we could be valuing instead. Kierkegaard framed this as a paradox of faith in relation to our objective duties. Heidegger framed this in terms of guilt, showing us that one chooses one set of values only at the expense of another. Well, Nietzsche called this the will to power, the endless competition between different wills and desires and the values they seek, wherein only the strongest values survive. Jaspers has a somewhat different angle. Oops. Sorry there. First, he points out that the competition between values doesn't always have to be so cut and dry. In most of our day-to-day lives, we find a balance of values that seems to be wholly satisfying. However, when we think we found a balance in our values, even though we think we found a balance in our values, all it takes is a little introspection and critical thinking to realize that no combination of values is ever absolute. Moreover, there's a number of moments and events in our lives to which no objective set of values is capable of standing up to. And we'll explain these in just a second. As a free and subjective entity, the value of our own subjectivity puts us into constant conflict with the objective world. Thus, it's inevitable that, to borrow some Sartrean terms, the fort self of our own subjectivity will inevitably find itself at odds with our objective identity and the objective values we associate with it. Every so often, the values we've chosen become completely and resolutely irreconcilable with our life experience. These moments are what Jaspers calls limit situations, and they are moments of incredible desperation, moments of complete psychological breakdown. In them, one's reduced to their spiritual and existential core, and the absolute relativity of everything. There, one has only oneself to turn to for the strength to confront these life-shattering challenges and to leap forward into the abyss of the unknown. Jaspers identifies 5 fundamental events that bring on such limit situations. He calls these events decisive antinomies, moments characterized by the complete incompatibility between our subjective and objective existence. First, there is death, in the shadow of which our objective existence seems meaningless, and our subjective existence is unable to escape. Second, guilt, the realization that all objective values and actions one freely chooses necessarily exclude other good ones. Third, suffering, the pain of which renders the objective world meaningless, and to which the subject cannot choose a way out of, but simply has to bear until it's run its course. Fourth, strife, or conflict with others, the resolution of which depends on their subjectivity as much as it depends on our own free will. And finally, chance, the fact that no matter how one subjectively chooses, and no matter how objective their life seems to be, chance or tragedy can strike at any moment, erasing everything. Try as we might to duck and dodge these moments, we'll likely have to reconcile with them several times throughout our lives, especially death, the inevitable end of it all. Unlike the other antinomies to which we can, quote, take a stand, end quote, there's simply no choice around it. Sure, we can delay death with exercise, low stress, and other wise choices, but sooner or later you're going to have to face it head on. And, like all the other antinomies, one really can't say how they're going to react to death until they find themselves face to face with it. Viktor Frankl, world-renowned psychologist and Holocaust survivor, believes that it's misleading to speak of self-fulfillment or self-realization. To achieve either would be to objectify oneself and to deny one's infinite potential. Rather, Frankl reminds us that it's okay to think of your life as meaningless, because because one is a will to meaning, but not any particular objective one. Therapists should therefore focus on helping a person realize the many possibilities at their disposal. Towards this end, he finds Jaspers' existentialism fruitful, and sees existentialism as born out of the collective limit situations and crises of the 2 world wars. Interestingly, he believes that limit situations aren't always individual, but that every age suffers from its own neuroses, and every age needs its own psychotherapy. Paul Tillich, theologian and Christian existentialist, expands upon the existential concept of anxiety or angst in the face of, quote, the awareness of non-being, end quote, that we all experience and which we cannot, as mortal beings, escape. He identifies 3 types of anxiety, each according to the, quote, direction in which non-being threatens being, end quote. They are the anxiety of fate and death, the anxiety of emptiness and meaninglessness, and the anxiety of guilt and condemnation. As part of this week's reading analysis, you'll be explaining each of these in your own words. More so than any other scholar, Maurice Friedman helped to popularize the ideas of Martin Buber in North America after the Second World War. As editor of our textbook, Friedman's also included some excerpts from his own existential writings. This week's piece focuses on personal accountability and how we're ultimately responsible for our own actions. He finds much inspiration on this subject in the writings of Franz Kafka, and so I've selected one of my favorite short stories from Kafka for next week's reading. Friedman also discusses what he calls boundless guilt, the fusion of existential guilt with existential shame. Given that the idea of existential guilt comes to us from Heidegger, as you consider this week's readings on Heidegger and his affiliation with the Nazi Party, one wonders if he ever felt this kind of boundless guilt after the war, given that he was shamed in the philosophic community, banned from teaching in his homeland, and never once offered a sign or statement of apology or regret for his actions during the war. Ethically speaking, de Beauvoir sees humanity as plagued by its own ambiguity. On the one hand, we are being for itself, the nothingness of subjective consciousness. On the other hand, we exist as being in itself, in both our objective bodies and our objective existence for others that we shape through concrete actions in the world. Although mutually exclusive, ambiguously we exist in these 2 modes of being. Returning to Hegel's master-slave paradox, she reminds us that we are masters of our own objective bodies in physical acts, but we are simultaneously subject to the judgment and mastery of others, who decide for themselves what to think of us and how to objectify our existence. Also, paradoxically, we as human beings have mastered our control over the natural world to an extent that now, with the existence of nuclear weapons, we're even capable of extinguishing humanity altogether. Ironically, the complete mastery of human destiny is also the possibility of the death of all. As we saw in both Hegel and Sartre, the passion of humanity is to be able to freely grasp its being for others in and through the freedom of others. However, as we saw last week, this is impossible. One can be either subject or object, but not both at the same time. In de Beauvoir's words, quote, "I should like to be the landscape which I am contemplating. I should like this sky, this quiet water to think themselves within me, that it might be I whom they express in flesh and bone, and I remain at a distance." End quote. Unfortunately, I cannot be the landscape, and as we saw last week, I cannot be the other consciousness that sees me. Nonetheless, quoting Sartre, de Beauvoir reminds us that humanity is, quote, "a being who makes himself a lack of being in order that there might be being," end quote, which is to say that we choose to express ourselves objectively so that we can still exist in the world. In Hegelian terms, de Beauvoir astutely observes that man's, quote, "being is lack of being, but this lack has a way of being which is precisely existence." In Hegelian terms, it might be said that we have here a negation of the negation by which the positive is reestablished. Man makes himself a lack, but he can deny the lack as lack and affirm himself as a positive existence. End quote. The nothingness of the for itself constantly makes itself a positive somethingness in choosing to act in the world. However, we must be careful that in the process of objectifying our being, that we don't do so irreparably, for instance in death, or that we don't lose ourselves in the bad faith of believing that we are the objective things that we do and say. Ultimately, consciousness remains the negation of our objective acts and the free will to do completely different things. We must also keep in mind that in acting in the world, we have no absolute value to which we can appeal when choosing how to act. Being genuine to our own existence and acting in good faith, one does not recognize any foreign absolute, divine, metaphysical, or otherwise. Only we create value and desire, and attribute objects to them, which is to say that in recognizing the nothingness of our own being, we have the infinite potential to make somethingness of it. Outside of our own existence, there is nothing. In choosing to live, one therefore chooses everything, which means that one is, quote, "responsibility for a world which is not the work of a strange power, but of himself, where his defeats are inscribed, and his victories as well." End quote. Thus, the nothingness of our own being doesn't create the impossibility of establishing ethics. Rather, each one of us is charged with creating our own ethic in such a way that its choosing is simultaneously a choosing for all. In her conclusion, de Beauvoir reminds us that choosing to live in the world, quote, "is not solipsistic, since the individual is defined only by his relationship to the world and to other individuals. He exists only by transcending himself, and his freedom can be achieved only through the freedom of others." End quote. Extending de Beauvoir's logic, in that the objective meaning of my life is determined by others, my objective being isn't free unless all others are free too. I am not fully free to become until all are fully free to become. We will return to this idea next week when we look at some existential responses to the necessarily bigoted institution of colonialism. In the last set of readings this week, you'll consider one of the vitriolic controversies in the history of philosophy, which revolves around the question, who was Heidegger? Like a detective, you'll be presented with some objective facts about Heidegger and his relationship with the Nazi Party of Germany during the Third Reich. For instance, it's a fact that Heidegger was a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party from 1933 to 1934. Under Hitler, he served as rector of Freiburg University, which was previously held by his mentor, Edmund Husserl, who was forced to give his seat over to Heidegger because he was Jewish. As rector, Heidegger was personally responsible for the firing of Jewish professors and gave several well-documented pro-Nazi speeches. After the war, Heidegger never repudiated National Socialism, but only lamented its failure. Nietzsche once suggested that to understand a philosophy, we must understand the philosopher. Only then does a full picture emerge. However, reconciling Heidegger's life to his philosophy is a problem. Heidegger denies that he's doing ethics in his fundamental ontology, but it's not so obvious that his philosophic views are entirely separable from his personal and political commitments. Can we separate the philosopher from the philosophy? To what degree was Heidegger not existentially guilty, but, as Friedman calls it, boundlessly guilty? If, at the time, he freely chose to support the Nazis, why should he apologize for his authentic choice? Would a public apology have been an act of bad faith? These are just some of the questions that will likely be in your head as you're asked to render your own judgment of Heidegger and his responsibility in the reading analysis assignment for this week. So that's it for now. Don't forget to keep working on your final paper, to complete the reading analysis questions, and to post your reply to last week's discussion. Thanks.